A small wooden box sat on the table. Inside were years of work, hundreds of sketches, pages of calculations, ideas that had consumed a man's life. On the outside of the box was a simple instruction telling the recipient to protect what was inside. A few days later, the man who packed it was dead. He was only 30 years old. Today, almost nobody remembers his name. Yet some historians believe he solved one of aviation's greatest problems decades before the Wright brothers ever left the ground. The strange part isn't that he was forgotten. History forgets people all the time. The strange part is what happened afterward, because years after his death, engineers began encountering ideas that looked remarkably familiar. Ideas that seemed connected to papers hidden inside that box. Ideas that helped shape the future of flight. But by then, the inventor who created them was long gone. His name was Alphonse Pénaud, and his story begins with a boy who couldn't run. While other children raced through the streets of Paris, Alphonse often watched from the side. A painful condition affecting his hips and legs made simple movement difficult. Some days he could walk comfortably. Other days, even short distances became exhausting. Children notice these things. They notice who can join the game and who cannot. For a young boy, that can be lonely. Yet those long hours of watching gave him something unexpected. Time to observe, time to think, time to become fascinated by things other children ignored. Birds became one of those fascinations, not simply because they could fly, because they made it look effortless. An albatross could glide for miles. A swallow could change direction in an instant. Even the pigeons of Paris seemed to possess a secret humanity had never fully understood. How did they stay balanced? How did they remain stable when the wind changed? Why didn't they simply tumble from the sky? Most adults dismissed such questions. Alphonse couldn't stop asking them. Years later, friends would remember how intensely focused he could become once something captured his curiosity. One question would lead to another, then another, then another, until he disappeared into notebooks and sketches for weeks at a time. The timing could not have been better or worse, because Alphonse was growing up during an age of invention. Every year seemed to bring a new breakthrough. Railroads stretched across continents. Steamships crossed oceans. Scientists announced discoveries that sounded impossible only a generation earlier. The world was changing at breathtaking speed, yet one challenge remained unconquered: flight. Humans could float beneath balloons. That much had been proven. But balloons were prisoners of the wind. They drifted wherever nature decided. True flight, the ability to travel where you wanted when you wanted, remained beyond reach. Most experts considered it unrealistic. Some considered it absurd. And a few openly mocked anyone chasing the dream. One respected engineer reportedly remarked that controlled human flight would arrive around the same time people learned to walk on the moon. The audience laughed. The point was clear: never. But Alphonse paid attention to something others missed. The greatest inventors rarely begin by asking what's impossible. They begin by asking why something seems impossible. That difference changed everything. As a teenager, he immersed himself in scientific journals, engineering papers, and reports from inventors across Europe. Many of these experiments ended in failure. Some ended in embarrassment. One inventor crashed a glider almost immediately after launch. Another spent a fortune building a flying machine that never left the ground. Most people saw proof that flight couldn't be done. Alphonse saw clues. Every failure contained information. Every crash answered a question. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The problem wasn't simply getting airborne. In fact, several inventors had already managed that. The real problem appeared seconds later. The machine lost balance. The machine lost control. The machine crashed, again and again. No matter how clever the design, stability remained the enemy. And then one evening, while studying the reports spread across his desk, a thought occurred to him. A simple thought. What if everyone was solving the wrong problem? What if the secret wasn't making a machine fly, but making it want to stay flying? That idea would consume the next years of his life. And eventually, it would lead him to build a small machine that looked so insignificant that most people walked right past it without a second glance. Children barely noticed. Adults ignored it. No newspaper reporter bothered to attend its demonstration. Yet within seconds of leaving the ground, that tiny machine would accomplish something many experts believed was impossible. And it would convince Alphonse Pénaud that humanity's future was no longer on the roads, but in the sky. The machine looked more like a toy than a revolution. It could fit comfortably in a person's hands. Its frame was made of lightweight wood. Its wings were covered with thin paper and silk, and at its center sat something almost laughably simple, a twisted rubber band. That was the engine. No steam, no coal, no massive machinery, just stored tension waiting to be released. To most people, it seemed impossible that something so small could prove anything important. But Alphonse wasn't trying to impress a crowd. He was trying to answer a question that had frustrated inventors for decades. Could a flying machine balance itself? Because that was where nearly everyone failed. Getting into the air was difficult. Staying there was the real challenge. Again and again, inventors built machines that briefly worked. Then gravity reclaimed them. The pattern repeated so often that many experts believed instability was simply unavoidable. Alphonse wasn't convinced. For months he had been studying birds, not how they flapped, not how high they flew, how they recovered. A sudden gust pushed them sideways. Moments later they were level again. Something in their design naturally fought against imbalance. What if a machine could do the same? That idea became an obsession. He adjusted wing angles, changed weight distribution, modified tail surfaces, built model after model. Most failed. Some spun wildly. Others dove directly into the ground. One broke apart almost instantly. Each failure cost time. Each failure taught something. And slowly, almost invisibly, progress appeared. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. The location wasn't a grand laboratory. There were no famous scientists watching, no government officials, no cheering crowd, just an ordinary public garden in Paris. People strolled past without paying attention. Children played nearby. A few curious onlookers glanced in his direction. Nothing more. Nobody present realized they were about to witness one of aviation's most important moments. Alphonse knelt on the grass. The little aircraft rested in front of him. His hands moved carefully. The rubber band tightened. One twist. Two twists. 10, 20, more. The propeller resisted. Energy built inside the mechanism. A friend watching nearby later recalled that Alphonse seemed unusually nervous, not frightened, focused. The kind of focus that comes when years of effort are about to face a single moment of truth. Because this flight mattered. If it failed, it would simply become another forgotten experiment. Another machine that promised much and delivered nothing. And history was already filled with those. For a moment he hesitated. Then he let go. The propeller blurred into motion. The machine surged forward. At first nothing seemed unusual. Then it lifted. Not much, just enough. A few feet above the ground, but it stayed there. 5 seconds, 6, 7. Instead of diving, it climbed slightly. Instead of wobbling uncontrollably, it corrected itself. Instead of crashing, it continued flying. A wider circle now. Smooth. Stable, predictable. The people nearby began noticing. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. One child reportedly chased after it across the grass. 11 seconds. Today, that sounds insignificant. But those 11 seconds quietly challenged decades of assumptions. Because the machine wasn't simply airborne. It was stable. And stability was the missing piece everyone had been searching for. When it finally descended, it landed gently. No crash, no disaster, no dramatic ending, just proof, small, simple, undeniable. Alphonse picked up the aircraft and examined it. Those who knew him expected celebration. There wasn't any. Instead, he became strangely quiet. Because while everyone else saw a successful model airplane, he saw something much larger. He saw passenger aircraft. He saw international travel. He saw a future most people considered impossible. And for the first time, he genuinely believed he might live to help create it. News of the flight spread through scientific circles, not like a sensation, more like a whisper. Engineers began discussing the little machine. Inventors requested details. Researchers studied its design. One respected observer made a remark that would prove remarkably accurate. He said the future of flight might belong to the people who understood stability better than power. At the time, almost nobody appreciated how important that statement was, but Alphonse did, because while others were obsessing over bigger engines, he had quietly solved a different problem, and that solution was attracting attention, not all of it friendly. Within a few years, some influential engineers would praise his work, others would dismiss it entirely. One critic would publicly argue that model aircraft proved nothing about real flight. Another would claim that Alphonse's ideas could never scale up to carry a human being. The debate was only beginning, but hidden inside that debate was an opportunity that could change his life forever. Because after the success of the little aircraft, someone approached Alphonse with a proposal that might finally allow him to build a real flying machine. The problem was, accepting it would require risking everything he had worked for. For the first time in his life, Alphonse Pénaud felt as if the future was within reach. The little aircraft had done more than fly. It had started conversations. And in the world of invention, conversations could become opportunities. A few weeks after the demonstration, Alphonse found himself sitting across from a group of men who had money, influence, and one thing every inventor desperately needed: connections. They weren't aviation experts. Very few people were, but they understood business, and they understood opportunity. One of them picked up the tiny aircraft and turned it over in his hands. Then he asked the question Alphonse had been waiting to hear. What comes next? For a moment, Alphonse almost couldn't answer, because the truth sounded ridiculous. He wanted to build a machine that could carry people through the air, not a balloon, not a glider, a real aircraft. The room grew quiet. Then someone laughed, not cruelly, just instinctively. It was the kind of laugh people make when they hear something that sounds impossible. Another man asked how much such a project would cost. Alphonse gave his estimate. The smiles disappeared. The amount was far beyond what most inventors could raise on their own. The meeting ended politely. Promises were made. Hands were shaken. Nothing happened. Weeks passed. Then months. The investors never returned. It was Alphonse's first lesson in a reality many inventors eventually face. People love breakthroughs, they fear risks, and building the future is almost always a risk. Still, the rejection didn't stop him. If anything, it made him more determined, because around this same time something unexpected happened. His work began attracting attention from serious engineers, not hobbyists, not dreamers, professionals, men whose opinions carried weight. Some praised his understanding of stability. Others requested copies of his findings. One engineer reportedly told a colleague that Pénaud's model aircraft contained ideas decades ahead of their time. For Alphonse, these moments mattered, because they confirmed he wasn't imagining things. The problem was that praise doesn't build machines. Money does, and money remained painfully scarce. So he continued working alone. His apartment slowly filled with sketches, large sketches, detailed sketches, machines far bigger than the little Planophore, machines designed to carry passengers, machines with enclosed cabins, machines with propellers and landing wheels, machines that looked strangely familiar to modern eyes. Years later, historians would stare at some of those drawings in disbelief, not because they were perfect, because they were so early. One design in particular featured elements that would not become common in aviation until decades later. An enclosed cockpit, advanced control arrangements, thoughtful weight distribution, a surprisingly modern layout. Yet when visitors saw these drawings in the 1870s, reactions varied dramatically. Some were fascinated. Others thought he had lost touch with reality. One visitor reportedly studied the sketches for several minutes before asking a question that haunted Alphonse for years. If this is truly possible, why hasn't anyone done it already? It sounded reasonable. The problem was that history often works backward. Once something exists, it feels inevitable. Before it exists, it feels absurd. Alphonse understood that better than anyone, but understanding it didn't make the loneliness easier. Because loneliness was becoming a constant companion, his health continued deteriorating. Simple movements often caused pain. Travel became difficult. Some days he worked through discomfort. Other days he worked through exhaustion. Yet he kept going, not because success was guaranteed, because stopping felt worse. And then, just as momentum seemed to be building, another problem appeared. A problem no amount of engineering could solve. Aviation was changing. Across Europe, other inventors were entering the race. New designs appeared every year. New experiments captured public attention. And suddenly Alphonse faced a frightening possibility. What if someone else reached the finish line first? For years he had been focused on solving the problem. Now he had to worry about time. Time was becoming his greatest enemy, not because competitors were moving quickly, because his own life seemed to be moving too quickly. Meanwhile, one of his most ambitious projects was finally taking shape. A full-sized aircraft design unlike anything most people had ever seen. If built, it could completely change how the world viewed flight. But building it would require funding, serious funding. And after so many disappointments, Alphonse was running out of people willing to listen. Then, in 1876, he made a decision. A bold decision. A risky decision. A decision that would place his ideas into the official historical record forever. He filed a patent, and what was inside that patent would leave some future aviation historians asking the same question. How did a young inventor in the 1870s manage to see so far ahead of his own time? The patent should have been a turning point. For years, Alphonse Pénaud had filled notebooks with ideas that existed only in private. Now those ideas were official, recorded, protected, real. And when people examined the drawings, some were stunned. The aircraft wasn't a crude flying machine held together by wishful thinking. It was carefully thought out. It had a long wing designed for stability. It included an enclosed passenger compartment. It featured control systems that suggested Alphonse wasn't merely imagining flight. He was imagining air travel. That distinction mattered. Many inventors were trying to leave the ground. Alphonse was already thinking about what people would do once they got there. One engineer reportedly studied the patent and remarked that the design seemed less like an experiment and more like a vehicle. For Alphonse, that was exactly the point. The dream had never been a machine that hopped across a field for a few seconds. The dream was transportation. The dream was changing the world. But dreams are expensive, and patents don't pay bills. Soon after filing, Alphonse began approaching potential backers again. This time he had more than enthusiasm. He had results. He had recognition. He had a documented design. Surely someone would listen now. At first it seemed promising. Several meetings were arranged. Influential people expressed interest. Questions were asked. Drawings were reviewed. For a brief moment, Alphonse allowed himself to believe things might finally be changing. Then reality returned. One investor admired the design but considered aviation too risky. Another preferred railroads. A third claimed flight might someday become possible, but not within his lifetime. The responses varied. The outcome remained the same: no funding, again and again and again. The rejections hurt more now because the stakes felt higher. When he was younger, failure felt temporary. Now it felt personal. He wasn't simply defending an idea anymore. He was defending years of his life. Meanwhile, something else was happening. The pain in his body was becoming harder to ignore. Some mornings he struggled to begin work. Some evenings he ended his day exhausted before accomplishing what he intended. Friends noticed. Family noticed. Even strangers occasionally noticed. The energetic inventor who once spoke excitedly about the future seemed increasingly worn down. Yet there was one thing he rarely discussed: fear. Not fear of failure, fear of running out of time. Because for the first time, Alphonse began seeing the future clearly enough to understand what he might miss. Imagine standing on a shoreline and seeing a ship approaching through the fog. You know it's coming. You know it's real. But you also know it may arrive after you're gone. That was the feeling beginning to settle over him. The cruel irony was that aviation itself was gaining momentum. Across Europe, inventors were experimenting with gliders, engines, propellers, and new theories of lift. Scientific societies discussed flight more seriously than ever before. What had once been dismissed as fantasy was slowly becoming a legitimate field of study. In many ways, Alphonse had helped make that happen. Yet while the field advanced, his personal situation worsened. Money grew tighter, opportunities became fewer, and then came a setback that struck particularly hard. One potential supporter, perhaps his best chance yet, initially expressed genuine enthusiasm. Meetings took place. Plans were discussed. Expectations grew. Then, without warning, the man withdrew. No aircraft, no investment, no explanation beyond vague concerns about risk. For Alphonse, it felt like watching a door close just as he reached it. And unlike previous disappointments, this one lingered. Because deep down, he knew something uncomfortable. The problem wasn't his ideas anymore. Many intelligent people now respected those. The problem was belief. Investors believed in railroads because they could see trains. They believed in ships because they could see ships, but they couldn't yet see a future filled with aircraft. Alphonse could, and that difference isolated him. By the end of the decade, his life had become divided into two realities. One reality existed on paper. There, his aircraft flew beautifully. Passengers crossed great distances. The future unfolded exactly as he imagined. The other reality existed outside his window. Bills accumulated. Pain increased. Support disappeared. And every passing year felt more precious than the last. Yet even in those difficult moments, he never stopped working, never stopped refining, never stopped preparing. Because somewhere inside him remained a stubborn belief that one breakthrough, one supporter, one opportunity could still change everything. What he didn't know was that the most important chapter of his story would not be written in a workshop, or a patent office, or even in the sky. It would be written in a small apartment in Paris, beside a wooden box, during the final months of his life. And it would leave behind a mystery that historians still discuss today. By 1880, Alphonse Pénaud had spent nearly a decade chasing a future that refused to arrive. The frustrating part was that he wasn't wrong. That may have been the hardest thing of all. If his ideas had been foolish, he could have abandoned them. If his calculations had been flawed, he could have accepted defeat. But every year seemed to prove him right, slowly, painfully. Other inventors were beginning to talk about stability, about balance, about aircraft design, concepts that Alphonse had been exploring for years. The world was moving in his direction, just not fast enough. One evening, a friend visited his apartment and found sketches spread across nearly every available surface. The table, the desk, even the floor. Aircraft were everywhere. Different wings, different propellers, different arrangements. Some represented old ideas, others were new. What struck the visitor most wasn't the quantity, it was the detail. Alphonse wasn't daydreaming, he was building a future on paper. The friend reportedly asked a simple question. "Do you really believe people will travel through the air someday?" Alphonse didn't hesitate. "Of course." Not maybe. Not possibly. Of course. The certainty surprised people, because certainty is rare when you're standing alone. And by now, Alphonse often felt very alone. The financial situation had become serious. There were days when practical concerns demanded more attention than invention. Patents required money. Research required money. Living required money. Dreams, unfortunately, required a great deal of money. Meanwhile, his health continued to decline. The pain he had carried since childhood seemed determined to accompany him into adulthood. Some days he could work for hours, others only minutes. Yet what troubled him most wasn't the physical discomfort. It was the possibility that his work might disappear. History is filled with inventions that vanished, not because they failed, because nobody preserved them. A notebook misplaced, a workshop emptied, a lifetime of effort quietly lost. The thought haunted him, more than failure, more than criticism, more than obscurity, because if the work disappeared, future inventors would have to start over. And Alphonse understood how difficult that road could be. Around this time, he began organizing his papers with unusual care, not casually, deliberately. Drawings were sorted, calculations were grouped together, notes were reviewed. Certain pages were rewritten more clearly, others were corrected. At first glance, it looked like preparation for a new project, but there was another possibility: preparation for absence. Years later, historians would wonder exactly what was happening during these months, because several accounts suggest Alphonse was working on something important, something separate from his earlier designs. A set of notes, additional calculations, possibly even ideas for powering larger aircraft. The details remain unclear. What is clear is that not all of those papers survived, and that mystery has followed his story ever since. One biographer later described it this way: "We know what Alphonse accomplished. We do not fully know what he was about to accomplish." That distinction matters, because some of the people closest to him noticed a change. He spoke less about the past, more about the future, less about recognition, more about preservation, almost as though he had accepted that someone else might ultimately finish the journey. One evening, as Paris settled into darkness, Alphonse sat alone reviewing his work. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Carriages passed beneath gas lamps. People hurried home. Conversations drifted through the streets. Ordinary life continued. Inside the apartment, however, a decision was being made. A wooden box rested nearby, small, plain, unremarkable, yet few objects would become more important in his story. Carefully, he began placing documents inside: drawings, calculations, notes. Years of effort condensed into a collection that could be carried under one arm. Each sheet represented time he would never get back, questions he had spent years answering, dreams he still hoped might survive. The process took hours, perhaps longer. No one knows exactly what he was thinking, but one possibility feels impossible to ignore. Maybe he had finally realized that the future he imagined was coming, with or without him. And if that was true, then preserving the knowledge mattered more than preserving himself. Before sealing the box, he added something else: a message, simple, personal, a final request concerning the work he had devoted his life to. Then he closed the lid, and with that single act, the story began moving toward an ending that nobody around him was prepared for. Because within days, Paris would wake to devastating news, and the young inventor who believed humanity belonged in the sky would be gone, leaving behind a wooden box. And a legacy far larger than he ever lived to see. The news barely made a ripple across Paris. No crowds gathered outside his apartment. No special editions of newspapers filled the streets. No national figures paused their work to honor him. On an October day in 1880, Alphonse Pénaud died at the age of 30. And for most of the world, nothing seemed to change. That may be the saddest part of the story, not that he died young. History contains many lives cut short. It's that almost nobody understood what had been lost. At the time, Alphonse was not seen as a man standing at the edge of the future. He was viewed as an inventor with interesting ideas, a dreamer, a talented engineer, perhaps even a visionary, but not someone who would help shape the next century. That realization would come much later. The wooden box remained behind. Inside were the drawings, calculations, and notes he had carefully preserved. Years of work reduced to paper. Years of hope reduced to ink. And yet, for all the attention historians would later give those documents, the mystery remained. Not everything was there. Several people familiar with his final months believed additional papers had existed. Drafts, calculations, working notes, ideas he had been developing shortly before his death. Those papers never appeared. Whether they were misplaced, discarded, or simply never completed, nobody knows. The result is one of the quiet mysteries surrounding his life. Not a conspiracy, not a hidden treasure, just an unanswered question. What else was he working on, and how close was he to solving it? As the years passed, aviation continued moving forward. New inventors emerged. New experiments were conducted. Gliders improved. Engines became lighter. The impossible slowly became difficult. Then difficult became achievable. And something remarkable began happening. People started rediscovering Pénaud's work. One engineer encountered his writings and recognized familiar concepts. Another studied his aircraft layouts and noticed how advanced they seemed for their time. Historians examining early aviation repeatedly found themselves returning to the same name, Alphonse Pénaud, again and again and again. What surprised them wasn't simply that he had been ahead of his time. Many inventors are ahead of their time. What surprised them was how far ahead. The little Planophore suddenly looked less like a toy and more like a breakthrough. His aircraft designs looked less like fantasies and more like previews. His focus on stability looked less like an interesting theory and more like one of the foundations of practical flight. In other words, the future eventually caught up to him. It just arrived too late. Imagine spending years describing automobiles in a world that still rides horses, or describing the internet in a world that only knows telegraphs. That's the position Alphonse often occupied. The ideas made sense. The world simply wasn't ready yet, and perhaps that explains why his story feels so modern. Even today, people encounter the same challenge. Scientists, artists, inventors, entrepreneurs, people who see something before everyone else sees it. Sometimes they're celebrated, sometimes they're ignored, and sometimes they spend years carrying a vision nobody else fully understands. Alphonse belonged to that last group. But there is one more layer to his story, one final irony. When the Wright brothers achieved their famous flight in 1903, Alphonse had been gone for 23 years. 23 years, think about that. He never saw an airplane leave the ground, never saw the headlines, never saw the celebrations, never saw the world finally accept that human flight was possible. Yet many of the principles that helped make those achievements possible had occupied his mind decades earlier. Not because he invented aviation alone. He didn't. No single person did. Aviation was built by countless pioneers across generations, but some contributed pieces of the puzzle that were too important to ignore. And Alphonse was one of them, which leaves us with a question, not about airplanes, not about patents, not even about history, a question about people. How many others like him have been forgotten? How many names disappeared simply because they arrived too early? How many futures were imagined by people who never lived long enough to see them? Because the answer is probably far greater than we realize. And that brings us to the final chapter of Alphonse Pénaud's story. Not his death, not his inventions, his legacy. Because sometimes the most important part of a person's life begins after they're gone. By the time the 20th century arrived, the world Alphonse Pénaud had imagined was beginning to take shape. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece. A new glider appeared, a better engine was invented, another pioneer solved a different problem. The puzzle of flight, which had frustrated humanity for centuries, was finally coming together. And scattered throughout that puzzle were ideas Alphonse had explored decades earlier. Most people never noticed. History rarely pauses to identify every hand that helped build the future. Instead, it prefers milestones. A first flight, a famous photograph, a single breakthrough. Those moments are easier to remember. The truth is usually more complicated. Behind every historic achievement stand countless people whose names slowly faded from public memory. Alphonse became one of them. Yet his influence refused to disappear completely. As aviation historians dug deeper into the origins of flight, they kept finding him, his papers, his models, his patents, his calculations. Again and again, researchers arrived at the same conclusion. The young French inventor had understood things that many of his contemporaries had missed, not because he possessed some secret knowledge, because he asked different questions. While others focused entirely on getting into the air, Alphonse obsessed over staying there. While others chased power, he chased stability. And in doing so, he helped solve a problem that would eventually become essential to modern aviation. But perhaps the most remarkable part of his story isn't what he accomplished. It's what he never received. He never received fame. He never received wealth. He never received the satisfaction of watching the world prove him right. Instead, he spent much of his life battling pain, rejection, uncertainty, and the feeling that he was running out of time. Yet he kept working anyway. That kind of persistence is easy to admire from a distance. Living it is something else entirely, because persistence becomes much harder when success remains invisible, when nobody is applauding, when nobody is investing, when nobody is certain you're right. And yet Alphonse continued. Not for recognition, not for history books, not even for credit. He continued because he genuinely believed the future would fly, and he wanted to help it get there. Every so often, a story like his reminds us that progress is not always made by the people standing in the spotlight. Sometimes it's made by the person sitting alone at a desk long after everyone else has gone home. The person whose name doesn't survive. The person whose work becomes so successful that future generations forget where it started. In many ways, that's exactly what happened to Alphonse Pénaud. Today, millions of people board airplanes without a second thought. Business travelers cross oceans overnight. Families visit countries that earlier generations could only dream of seeing. Aircraft connect continents, cultures, and lives. Most passengers will never hear the name Alphonse Pénaud. They'll never know about the young inventor in Paris, the boy who watched other children run, the man who spent years sketching impossible machines, the inventor who packed his life's work into a wooden box before the world was ready to understand it. And perhaps that's why his story matters, because history isn't only about famous victories. Sometimes it's about unfinished journeys. People who planted seeds they never saw grow, dreams that required another generation to bloom. Every time an airplane lifts from a runway, thousands of people are responsible for making that moment possible. Engineers, mechanics, pilots, designers, inventors. Among them, whether most people realize it or not, is a young Frenchman who believed in flight when many intelligent people still considered it impossible. His dream outlived him. His ideas outlived him. And in a way, every aircraft that rises into the sky carries a small piece of that dream with it. Before you go, I'd love to know your thoughts. What stayed with you most about Alphonse's story? Was it the tiny aircraft that changed aviation history? The years he spent pursuing an idea almost nobody believed in? Or the fact that he never lived to see the future he helped create? Let me know in the comments. And if this forgotten story meant something to you, consider subscribing for more journeys into the lives history nearly left behind. Because sometimes the people we remember least are the ones who changed the world the most. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.